If you think the Middle Ages were all castles, knights, and shining armor, you're about to get a cold slap of reality. Tonight, we're diving into the side of history that never makes it into fairy tales, the side where justice wasn't about truth, but terror. Punishments weren't hidden away in sterile prisons, they were public theater, meant to shame, scar, and entertain entire communities. Imagine standing in a market square, the smell of roasting meat mixing with the stench of sweat and fear, while your neighbor's body is bound, branded, or broken, all to remind you that the law ruled not only your life, but your flesh. This is the Middle Ages, stripped of its romance. A world where theft cost you a hand, gossip could cost you your tongue, and the wrong word whispered at the wrong time could see you chained, dunked, or burned before your friends and family. And the crowd? They weren't horrified. They were the audience, the judges, sometimes even the executioners themselves. So before we start, do me one favor, drop a comment below and tell me what time it is where you're watching from right now. Because as you'll see, in the Middle Ages, time wasn't just measured by clocks or calendars. It was measured by how long you lasted in the stocks, how many lashes you endured, or how many minutes it took before the fire consumed you. Welcome to the disturbing punishments of the Middle Ages. Chapter 1: Hunger, Ice, and the Tyranny of the Season. Forget the fairy tale image of snowy villages glowing with lantern light and peasants singing carols under frosted rooftops. A medieval winter was not charming. It was suffocating, relentless, and often lethal. Imagine the moment after the last harvest festival, when the final sheaves of wheat were stored and the barns locked tight. The mood didn't lift with feasting, it sank with dread, because every villager knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the clock was ticking. Whatever food you had in your larder in October had to stretch through March, sometimes April, and in years of brutal weather, even into May. There was no supermarket to restock, no trucks bringing citrus from Spain, no flour barges rolling down the Rhine if snow choked the roads. You lived or died by your summer labor and your Lord's generosity, or lack thereof. Chroniclers record famine years with chilling precision. In England's Great Famine of 1317, torrential rains ruined crops across Europe, killing livestock and rotting grain. In some regions, the price of bread soared by over 200%, meaning a loaf cost 2 or 3 days' wages for a laborer. Thousands starved, not because food vanished entirely, but because scarcity inflated costs beyond what ordinary families could bear. And famine didn't just mean hunger, it meant substitution. People ground acorns, weeds, even powdered bark into bread, creating loaves that were technically edible but shredded intestines like knives. In France, accounts describe children with distended bellies, mothers scavenging dead animals from ditches, even whispers of cannibalism at the fringes of civilization. Winter magnified every scarcity. Dairy cows went dry, hens stopped laying, rivers froze and blocked fish runs. The noble's castle still feasted. Wine mulled with spice, roasted venison, bread warmed by ovens. But in villages, peasants boiled the same watery cabbage stew, day after day, until malnutrition hollowed their cheeks. Death was not swift but grinding. By February, bodies gave out, their immune systems eroded by months of inadequate calories. Monasteries kept ledgers of burials, and the spikes in January through March are unmistakable. Winter culled the weak like a butcher trims fat, indifferent and methodical. And don't forget the psychological weight. With daylight shrunk to barely 8 hours, and cold penetrating walls built of wattle and daub, despair seeped in. Medieval people knew little of vitamin D or seasonal affective disorder, but they knew depression, lethargy, and the gnawing dread that the barrel of salted herring would run out before the thaw. Winter was not a postcard, it was an executioner with a slow blade. Chapter 2: Frozen Bones, Silent Roads, and the Kingdom of Death. Now imagine stepping outside in January, when even the air seemed hostile. Snowdrifts could swallow entire paths, isolating villages for weeks. Roads hardened into ice traps, where a single slip could break a limb, a death sentence if infection set in. Bridges cracked under frost. Ferries froze mid-river. Commerce didn't just slow, it stopped. A medieval winter could turn thriving markets into ghost squares. The only sound the crunch of boots and the bark of half-starved dogs fighting over scraps. Travel, already dangerous, became near suicidal. Bandits roamed forest roads, knowing fewer patrols dared the cold, and starvation made them bolder. Chronicles from Scandinavia and Germany mention travelers freezing to death only yards from villages, their bodies discovered in spring, stiff as statues, clutching rosaries with fingers fused by frost. For the poor, clothing was inadequate. Wool tunics, patched hose, rough cloaks, leather boots often leaked, and mittens were a luxury. Fur belonged to the nobility, leaving peasants to wrap rags around feet and hands, praying frostbite would not set in. Archaeological remains show bones with lesions caused by frost damage, amputations crudely healed, fingers and toes lost to winters that showed no mercy. And then came disease. Winter didn't stop sickness, it nurtured it. Cramped cottages with shuttered windows trapped smoke, damp, and breath. Lice spread typhus. Rats carried plague, and the weakened, malnourished immune systems of peasants could not resist. Mortality soared in winters following bad harvests. Cemeteries from the 14th century show mass graves filled disproportionately with children and the elderly, the demographic most vulnerable to prolonged cold and hunger. The irony? Winter was also cleaner. Parasites died back in the frost. Filth was frozen solid, and summer's putrid stench disappeared. But this was no comfort when warmth came only from the hearth, and firewood itself became scarce. Forests were jealously guarded by lords, and peasants caught stealing wood risked mutilation or death. Some burned straw, dung, even furniture to survive, choices that blackened lungs and poisoned homes with smoke. And all the while, death became ordinary. Chroniclers describe bodies laid on carts, hauled to churchyards, stiff as planks, their mouths frozen open mid-prayer, and children played near them, not out of disrespect, but because death was everywhere, hanging on the gallows, rotting on plague carts, lying beneath snow. Winter made every town a necropolis in waiting, every night a lottery of survival. By March, survivors staggered into spring, not with joy, but with exhaustion, thinner, broken, haunted. And if famine continued, if rains spoiled the sowing again, they knew the cycle would repeat. Winter was not just a season, it was a predator, circling back every year, claiming its due. Chapter 3: Fire, Smoke, and the Battle Against the Cold. To understand a medieval winter, you have to think not of landscapes, but of fires, or rather, the lack of them. Warmth was the most precious commodity of the season, and yet it was the one thing peasants could never guarantee. Firewood was not simply lying in piles ready for the taking, it was property, guarded by laws as fierce as the weather. Forests belonged to lords, monasteries, or the crown, and cutting wood without permission was theft, punishable by fines, flogging, or mutilation. Yet without fuel, families froze. Archaeological digs in English villages reveal hearths filled not only with logs, but with fragments of furniture, burned doors, even broken plow handles, evidence of desperation when forests were out of reach. Chroniclers note that some families burned dried dung patties, a practice that filled huts with a choking stench. Smoke inhalation killed slowly, inflaming lungs and blackening thatched ceilings. In a single-room cottage, where humans, pigs, and chickens shared the same air, the hearth gave both life and disease. But even when wood was available, heat was miserly. Medieval chimneys were crude or non-existent until the late Middle Ages. Most homes simply vented smoke through a hole in the roof. That meant the fire had to be small, or else the entire room suffocated. So instead of warmth spreading evenly, people huddled around a meager flame while frost crept in at the edges of the room. In records from 14th century Scandinavia, villagers routinely slept in shifts to stay near embers, parents forcing children to rotate in and out of the circle of heat like soldiers on watch. Blankets were rare, mattresses thinner than modern doormats, often stuffed with straw that turned damp and moldy within weeks. The wealthier might own feather beds, but peasants dreamed of them the way we dream of palaces. Instead, many relied on the family bed, cramming parents, children, and sometimes livestock under a single cover to generate collective warmth. Picture this: a mother, 2 infants, 3 older children, and a goat jammed together on a pallet, breathing the same heavy air, while frost formed on the inner walls like a second skin, and fire carried another sinister danger. Houses burned down with terrifying frequency. Thatched roofs were tinder, and with sparks constantly drifting from open hearths, entire villages could ignite in minutes. Winter winds fanned flames across snow-dusted lanes, leaving families shivering not only from the cold, but from the loss of what little shelter they had. Chroniclers in Flanders record winters where entire rows of peasant cottages were reduced to ash, their residents forced to sleep in barns or caves, if not simply perish. So every decision, how much wood to burn, how long to keep embers alive, whether to risk cooking at night, was a gamble between freezing slowly or burning suddenly. The fire was friend and executioner, savior and saboteur, and as January dragged into February, the endless balancing act wore people down. Fires had to be fed, but food had to be cooked, and often one came at the expense of the other. The hearth was the medieval soul of the home, but in winter it was also its battlefield. Chapter 4: Shadows, Silence, and the Crushing Weight of Darkness. We forget, in our electrified world, that winter is not just about cold, it is about darkness. In the medieval calendar, December through February offered only 8 or 9 hours of weak gray daylight. Once the sun fell, villages dissolved into pitch black, broken only by firelight or the flicker of rush lamps dipped in tallow. And tallow wasn't cheap. It required animal fat, fat that might otherwise feed the family, so light was rationed as carefully as bread. Most peasants lived their evenings in near darkness, huddled in silence, whispering prayers or tales while shadows grew thick. Imagine the psychological toll. No books to read, no candles to brighten corners, only the slow crawl of night that lasted 14 hours or more. For the poor, winter was less a season than a sentence of enforced idleness, where work was limited, play was impossible, and despair festered in the void. Darkness was not just inconvenient, it was terrifying. Medieval minds brimmed with superstition, and night was considered the devil's playground. Wolves howled at the edges of forests, their numbers swollen in years of famine, when livestock carcasses drew them close to villages. Chroniclers in Eastern Europe recount winters where wolf packs entered towns, dragging away children from doorsteps. And because lamps were scarce, travel at night was unthinkable. A peasant who dared the road after sunset risked vanishing, swallowed by snow, robbed by bandits, or claimed by unseen spirits. Winter nights magnified every sound: the creak of beams, the scurry of rats, the groan of wind through shutters, until imagination turned them into demons, witches, or restless souls. Confession records reveal that entire families believed their cottages haunted, the long dark hours breeding hallucinations and paranoia. Priests warned that idleness opened the door to the devil, so winter nights became moral battlegrounds. Families prayed aloud, sang psalms, or repeated stories of saints to push back the creeping despair. Yet the mind rebelled. Chroniclers note bursts of madness, villagers screaming in the night, mothers claiming visions of demons, men wandering into the snow in fits of delirium. Darkness stripped away reason as surely as famine stripped flesh, and there was no escape. Unlike summer, when work filled every hour and sun illuminated the sky until late, winter days collapsed into a handful of chores before the long oppressive silence returned. For months at a time, Europe lived under a suffocating shroud of night. It was more than seasonal, it was existential. Winter was not just outside the door, it was inside the mind. Chapter 5: Pestilence in the Frost. When cold became a breeding ground for disease. It is tempting to think that cold alone protected medieval villages from pestilence, that frost locked germs in ice and cleared the air of rot, and in some ways winter did suppress certain parasites. Flies, fleas, and maggots dwindled when the ground froze. But the real horror of winter was not what it killed, it was what it trapped. Villages sealed themselves indoors, entire families and livestock crammed into huts scarcely larger than modern garages. One hearth smoldering, smoke half vented, windows shuttered against the icy wind. This was not comfort, it was a petri dish. Modern science tells us tuberculosis thrives in damp, unventilated spaces. Medieval chronicles describe consumption spreading each January like clockwork, hacking coughs rattling in huts where straw mattresses reeked of mildew. Children shared blankets infested with lice, passing typhus that killed by the hundreds. And rats, winter drove them closer to human quarters, gnawing grain bins, nibbling corpses, leaving fleas that carried the Black Death in the 14th century. Mortality records from plague years show spikes in January and February, the cruelest months when starvation made bodies weak and huddled living made infection inevitable. The statistics are staggering. During the Great Famine, 1315–1317, chroniclers in England and the Low Countries recorded mortality rates climbing to 10–15% of entire populations, tens of thousands dead in single counties, not from hunger alone, but from the sicknesses hunger invited. Dysentery flourished in winter when people ate moldy bread or tainted dried meat, their bodies unable to fight infection. Archaeological digs of medieval latrines reveal layers of parasite eggs, whipworm, roundworm, tapeworm, that swarmed in guts already weakened by starvation. Without soap, without clean water, peasants had no defense. Winter rivers froze, so villagers melted snow for drinking, often scooping up ash, soot, or animal droppings in the process. Diaries from monasteries mention monks boiling water and praying over it, yet even then outbreaks of ague swept through cloisters. And then came the madness of medicine. A child coughing blood in January might be bled with leeches, weakening him further. A fevered woman might be wrapped in wool soaked in vinegar, her sweat encouraged as purification. Doctors, when available, carried their urine charts, comparing colors against elaborate diagrams, as if winter fevers could be solved by arithmetic. The wealthy sometimes survived with heated rooms and exotic remedies, but peasants endured whatever herbs midwives could forage: moldy roots, dried nettle, powdered bone. In times of famine, even these remedies ran out. Winter medicine was less cure than ritual, a theater of hope in the face of inevitability. What made winter disease most terrifying was its persistence. A plague that began in December could roll through a town until March, felling entire households in sequence, leaving cottages silent and streets strewn with corpses waiting for thawed ground to dig graves. In especially brutal winters, bodies piled in barns, stacked in churches, or simply left under snow until spring. Wolves and dogs dug them out. Children stumbled over frozen limbs when paths reopened. And yet life continued. Markets reopened. Bells tolled. Sermons preached. Disease was no extraordinary event. It was woven into the seasonal rhythm. To be medieval was to accept that winter would bring not only cold, but pestilence, and that the hand of God or the devil would choose who endured and who succumbed. Survival was not victory, but reprieve, because every November the cycle began anew. Winter was not a season, it was a wheel, grinding flesh into dust, while the survivors trudged on, hollow-eyed and haunted, waiting for the next contagion to finish the work hunger had begun. Chapter 6: Rituals of Survival. Faith, Fear, and the Superstitions of the Long Winter. When night stretched too long and the frost seemed eternal, medieval people turned not only to fires and meager food, but to ritual. Survival in winter was not simply physical, it was spiritual. Every village layered prayers, charms, and desperate acts of faith onto their meager existence, because when famine and disease devoured neighbors, reason crumbled and superstition surged. Priests thundered that winter's hunger was punishment for sin, droughts and floods sent by God, wolves as his scourge. So peasants lined up in frozen chapels, fasting when they could barely eat, lighting candles when tallow should have been saved. Parish records from France describe towns holding 40-day processions during famine years, trudging barefoot through snow, chanting psalms until their feet bled. They believed every blister, every frostbite wound, was a plea for divine mercy. But faith alone did not quell fear. Winter birthed darker practices, rooted in pagan echoes and whispered traditions. Families hung sprigs of evergreen inside huts, not for decoration, but to ward off spirits, said to ride the frozen winds. In Germany, chronicles mention offerings of bread and milk left on thresholds for the wild hunt, a spectral procession believed to storm the skies on winter nights. To be caught outside was to risk being snatched by ghosts or transformed into prey. In Scandinavia, villagers burned wheels of straw rolled through snowfields to coax back the sun, a ritual that fused desperation with hope. Even within Christendom, these acts persisted, tolerated because priests knew better than to strip away the only comfort peasants had: superstition intertwined with survival. Mothers whispered charms into children's ears before sleep, prayers not found in any Bible, but believed to keep frost demons from stealing breath. Farmers crossed themselves 3 times before cutting frozen meat, lest famine spirits curse the meal. Chroniclers in Poland note that during the famine of 1317, desperate villagers accused neighbors of stealing the harvest with witchcraft, dragging women into snowbound trials by ordeal. Some were forced to plunge hands into icy water, their guilt judged by how frostbitten they emerged. In this way, winter bred not only hunger but hysteria, amplifying suspicion into violence. Every snowfall deepened paranoia, every failed loaf or spoiled cask became evidence of malice. And yet these rituals, however cruel, provided structure. They gave meaning to the endless dark, turned suffering into story. To bury a child in January was not simply grief, it was woven into a narrative of divine judgment, demonic interference, or ancestral curse. That narrative helped the survivors endure. Anthropologists today might call it coping mechanism, but to the medieval mind, it was truth. Winter was not just weather, it was spiritual war. The devil prowled in the cold, God tested with famine, saints interceded in dreams. Each villager was a soldier in that invisible battle. Thus winter was endured, not only with bread and fire, but with prayer and terror. Every frostbitten night became a vigil, every dawn a fragile reprieve. To survive meant not just feeding the body, but feeding belief. And belief could be as sustaining as bread or as destructive as poison. For in the long dark, when the snow muffled sound and the horizon disappeared, faith and fear blurred until they were indistinguishable. Winter did not just chill the bones, it remade the soul. Chapter 7. Witches and the Snow. Winter as a season of accusation. The longer winter stretched, the more its cruelties demanded explanations. And when reason failed, superstition filled the void. Hunger sharpened suspicions, and in the dark months, the figure of the witch loomed large, as both cause and scapegoat for every misfortune. When the cow stopped giving milk, when the grain bins ran empty too quickly, when a child coughed blood and wasted away, it was easier to imagine a neighbor stealing sustenance through sorcery than to accept that nature itself was indifferent. Records from Germany, Bohemia, and France show that accusations of witchcraft peaked in famine winters, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries. The logic was cruel but simple. If your family starved, someone else must have cursed your bread. If your pigs froze, someone must have whispered to the frost. Villagers whispered that witches could milk ropes, drawing butter and cream from knots, or that they could tie weather into strings, releasing snow with a tug. In the half-light of February, surrounded by hunger and silence, such beliefs were not delusion, they were survival narratives. And the accused were often the same, elderly widows with no family to defend them, midwives whose herbs failed to cure winter fevers, or women who lived at the margins of the village, and whose faces seemed too lined, too knowing. Trials were improvised, women forced to plunge hands into ice water, judged guilty if they resisted the cold too well, guilty if they failed to endure it, guilty if they cried. In Eastern Europe, the ordeal of winter swimming became a grotesque ritual, throwing accused witches into frozen rivers, declaring them witches if they floated, innocent if they sank and drowned. Chroniclers from Poland record entire villages gathered for such ordeals, the spectacle as much about releasing collective frustration as it was about justice. Fires were built, torches lit, and the condemned were sometimes burned in the very snowdrifts that had sparked the suspicion. Each death reassured the survivors that the cause of their misery was not the cruelty of climate or the indifference of nature, but the malice of human beings. This twisted comfort fed the cycle. The more brutal the winter, the more bodies were sacrificed in flames or drowned in icy water. And the most chilling fact is that such violence offered no relief. No crops sprouted, no cattle revived, no children healed. Yet the ritual persisted because it provided meaning to the meaningless. Winter's darkness was terrifying, but far worse was the idea that it was random. A witch at least gave the misery a face, a story, a villain to punish. And so winter became not only a season of famine and disease, but of human blood spilled by human hands, neighbors turning on neighbors, the cold air filled with screams as snowflakes drifted down, indifferent and eternal. Chapter 8: Scars of Survival, Bodies, Minds, and the Memory of Endless Winters. Surviving a medieval winter did not mean emerging unscathed. It meant carrying scars, physical and psychological, that lasted long after the thaw. Archaeological evidence shows skeletons with stunted growth, the legacy of childhood winters, where malnutrition stunted bones permanently. Ribs etched with signs of rickets, spines twisted by years of vitamin D deficiency, teeth eroded by diets of coarse bread, laced with husks or bark. All of these speak of bodies shaped by winters of scarcity. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, ears. Chronic frost-damaged bones reveal amputations that were crudely cauterized with hot irons. The survivors bore these disfigurements openly, walking reminders of winter's cruelty, each missing hand or scarred face an unspoken testimony, and the mind carried its own wounds. Winter bred trauma as surely as it bred hunger. Imagine a child who watched 3 siblings die between January and March, their bodies carried out stiff as firewood. That child grew into adulthood, with memory carved into every sense. The silence of snow equated with fear, the dim flicker of firelight tied forever to hunger. Monastic chronicles are filled with laments of despair, the winter melancholy as they called it, where monks confessed to visions, temptations, and breakdowns when darkness stretched too long. Villagers had no language for depression, but they lived it. Lethargy, hopelessness, bursts of paranoia, sudden violence during the deep months when the sun seemed permanently absent. Entire communities were shaped by this cycle of seasonal trauma. Collective memory held on to winters of disaster, 1315, 1348, 1437, as turning points, years spoken of in hushed tones, their survivors carrying bitterness like a second skin. And yet, these scars also structured society. Traditions of stockpiling, superstitions about evergreens, even the ritual of feasting in early winter were not quaint customs, but survival strategies encoded by generations of fear. Winter became not just a time of endurance, but a cultural scar embedded in folk tales, songs, and liturgies. The figure of death in medieval art, pale and skeletal, was not abstract. It was a memory of winter's past, when the reaper walked openly in snow-drifted lanes. And to survive was to be marked by him, to carry forward into spring with body weaker, mind darker, but faith somehow still intact. And that faith was less about hope than about endurance, the belief that suffering was inevitable, cyclical, and inescapable, that winter would return like a predator every year, and that survival was never victory, only reprieve. Thus the true legacy of medieval winters was not simply the graves they filled, but the generations they haunted, scars etched not only on bodies, but on the very imagination of Europe, shaping how people thought about God, fate, and the fragility of human life. Chapter 9: Lords of Frost, Power, Politics, and Winter as a Weapon. Winter was not only a natural disaster, it was a political tool, a weapon wielded by those who controlled resources. In the stratified world of medieval Europe, lords, abbots, and kings knew that hunger created obedience, and winter was the season when power could be most ruthlessly demonstrated. Grain stores were locked in castles and monasteries, guarded by armed men, while peasants shivered in huts gnawing bark bread. Nobles dined in halls where fires roared and tables groaned with venison. Eels imported spices, and the very contrast was intentional, a theater of dominance, the lord warm and fed, the peasant desperate and starving. Records from manorial accounts show lords inflating rents or demanding extra tithes in midwinter when refusal meant certain starvation. Those who resisted were evicted, their huts seized, their families turned into beggars, trudging through snowdrifts. Hunger wasn't just an accident of weather, it was engineered, leveraged, weaponized. In the famine winters of 1315, 1317, when torrential rains rotted harvests, chronicles tell of peasants storming abbey granaries, breaking doors with axes. The punishment? Executions staged in the snow, the bodies left stiff and pale outside village gates. The message was unmistakable. Winter belonged to the powerful, and rebellion was as futile as resisting the season itself. But winter was not only a weapon of scarcity, it was also a stage for authority to perform mercy. Kings who distributed alms, or lords who opened granaries, earned loyalty not only by feeding subjects, but by reinforcing the idea that survival was at their discretion. Chronicles describe kings parading carts of bread through starving towns, each loaf a reminder of dependence. Even the church used winter to magnify control. Sermons linked famine and frost to divine wrath, declaring that obedience to God and tithe was the only path to spring. In some regions, monasteries organized processions where starving peasants carried relics through snow-choked streets, begging for divine relief. The spectacle served two purposes: to pacify unrest and to reinforce the church's authority as mediator between man and weather, faith and famine. Winter also shaped warfare and politics on a grander scale. Armies often disbanded in cold months, but sieges sometimes dragged into winter intentionally, weaponizing starvation. Chroniclers describe besieged castles eating rats, dogs, even leather while snow piled against walls, the attackers waiting with patient cruelty, knowing the season itself would do the killing. In Russia, winter became a tool of defense. Rivers froze, supply lines collapsed, and invaders starved in icy fields. But for the peasant, politics and war meant nothing when the hearth was cold and the stomach empty. Winter's politics were intimate, not distant. Decisions made by a lord about firewood rights, by a priest about tithes, by a reeve about rents, each decree tightened or loosened the noose of survival. And because every villager knew that refusing authority in January could mean a grave in February, winter reinforced hierarchies more effectively than any sword. The season itself became part of the machinery of control, an annual reminder that survival was not earned, but granted or withheld by those who ruled. Winter was not only nature's tyranny, but man's. And for the peasant the frost bit twice, once from the air and once from the hand of power. Chapter 10: The Frozen Mind. Fear, Memory, and the Psychological Empire of Winter. The most insidious reality of medieval winter was not only what it did to bodies or bellies, but what it did to minds. To live through 5 or 6 months of hunger, cold, and darkness every year meant that fear was not occasional, it was structural, a foundation upon which thought itself was built. Children grew up associating snow with loss, frost with funerals, silence with starvation. Chroniclers speak of the melancholy of the season, a vague but persistent gloom that settled over villages in December and did not lift until April. Today, we'd call it depression, seasonal affective disorder, trauma, but to medieval people it was divine punishment, demonic temptation, or madness, and so the mind became colonized by superstition. A dream of fire was a prophecy, a raven in the snow was an omen, a sudden thaw was a trick of the devil. Winter taught people to see suffering as narrative, every cough or frostbite scar explained through sin, witchcraft, or fate. In this way, the season rewired imagination itself, embedding terror into the cultural DNA. The silence of winter deepened the effect. Nights stretched 14 hours, sometimes more, and in a world without clocks or electric light, time itself lost shape. Families sat in darkness, fire reduced to embers, the only sounds the groan of beams and the wind clawing at shutters. Chroniclers describe hallucinations, men seeing ghostly hunts in the sky, women hearing voices from snowdrifts, children claiming angels or demons visited them at night. Priests sometimes interpreted these visions as spiritual revelations, but more often they were signs of exhaustion, hunger, and psychological collapse. And memory made the wound permanent. Survivors of famine winters carried recollections so vivid they shaped entire generations. And wan so pyre, hout they dals of famine winters, persoth pever, they taken for bulls, and they brex ability, from symbol bold, fermented praff, fermented sove, fermented brew cords, fermented dolls of famine winters. Accounts from the 14th century show adults decades later recounting the exact taste of bark bread, the sound of wolves outside huts, the feel of siblings' bodies cooling in shared beds. Trauma was not personal, it was collective. Villages remembered famine years as markers of time, the year of empty fields, the winter of bones. Memory itself became a calendar, written in suffering, and the fear was self-perpetuating, because people expected winter to kill. They lived in anticipation of its cruelty. Autumn harvests were shadowed by dread. Every stored sack of grain, counted and recounted, every barrel of ale tapped with suspicion. By November, minds already trembled under the weight of what was coming. Winter became not only a season, but an empire of fear, stretching across months, shaping decisions, crushing hope, and when spring finally arrived, it brought no triumph, only relief. The thaw was not victory but reprieve, a brief breathing space before the cycle began again. And so, century after century, minds were bent into submission, shaped by a season that ruled more cruelly than any king. The disturbing reality is this: medieval winter was not just weather, it was psychology, a constant rehearsal of death that trained entire societies to live in fear. It forged cultures obsessed with mortality, religions saturated with sin and penance, and imaginations haunted by visions of frost and famine. To understand medieval Europe is to understand that it lived in the shadow of winter, not for months, but for centuries. Chapter 11: Bones in the Snow, Everyday Encounters with Winter Death. To live in a medieval winter was to walk among the dead, not in some abstract poetic way, but literally, daily, as part of the landscape. Death was not hidden in hospitals or sanitized behind closed doors. It lay in ditches, on cart paths, beneath barn eaves, waiting for thaw. Imagine trudging to market through knee-deep snow and passing a bundle by the roadside that you knew was not firewood, but a body stiffened into grotesque posture, mouth agape as though still gasping for breath. Chroniclers tell of winters where famine was so severe that corpses were left unburied until spring thawed the ground enough to dig. Archaeological digs in northern Europe confirm this. Pits filled with dozens of skeletons, hurriedly buried together when weather finally permitted, the remains showing signs of emaciation, disease, and frostbite. Wolves and dogs were frequent visitors to these frozen cemeteries, in waiting, dragging limbs from shallow snow cover, leaving grisly trails across village fields. And yet, death in winter was so common that villagers learned to step over it with weary resignation. Accounts from French parishes note that churchyards overflowed in famine years, coffins stacked in barns, while priests sprinkled frozen bodies with holy water as quickly as possible. Children grew up accustomed to the sight, playing near carts loaded with corpses, pulling sticks from skeletal hands for games, their innocence shaped by a world where mortality was entertainment and warning in equal measure. Death was not a singular event, but a constant companion, filling homes with silence, paths with obstacles, and memories with horror. And the methods of winter death were varied: starvation, hollowed eyes, until bodies collapsed beside hearths; frostbite took wanderers on snow-choked roads; pneumonia and fever carried off the elderly in smoky huts; and despair itself pushed people into fields where they simply lay down and surrendered to the cold. Chroniclers record suicides during famine winters, peasants walking into forests with ropes, or mothers smothering infants to spare them a slower, crueler demise. And yet, even in this climate of relentless loss, rituals emerged. Villagers draped frozen corpses in rough wool, carried them on sledges to chapels, where priests muttered prayers as their beards froze solid. Bells tolled, not just daily but hourly, their sound mingling with howls of wolves and the cracking of ice. To be medieval was to hear the sound of death as often as the sound of life, and this constant familiarity stripped mortality of shock. Bones in the snow became markers of direction, corpses on gallows doubled as signposts, graveyards spilled into farmland until plows struck skulls. Life and death blurred, entwined like frost around branches, and winter was their stage. To survive such a season was not to escape death. It was simply to postpone it, to carry the memory of bones and snow like a second skin, a reminder that winter's scythe never stopped swinging. Chapter 12: The Aftermath of Silence. Psychological Scars of Winter Survival. When the thaw finally came, the silence was almost worse than the storms. Spring did not erase the trauma of winter, it unveiled it. Melted snow revealed the bodies hidden for months, bones picked clean by scavengers, faces unrecognizable, yet still identifiable by clothing or scraps of hair. Villagers returned to fields and paths only to discover reminders of those who hadn't survived the season, and the landscape itself seemed haunted. The silence after the screams, the stillness after the coughing and moaning, had ceased, weighed heavier than the noise itself. Survivors staggered into April thin, hollow-eyed, trembling not only from hunger, but from the memories carved into their minds. Modern science calls this post-traumatic stress, but medieval people had no such term. They explained it as demonic temptation, divine punishment, or melancholy of the soul, but its symptoms were the same: sleeplessness, hallucinations, bursts of violence, profound despair. Chroniclers in monasteries describe brothers breaking down in tears during Lent, unable to sing hymns because they remembered the faces of children starved in January. Parish records show confessions spiking after famine winters, villagers admitting to thefts of bread, to cursing neighbors, to terrible thoughts because they feared their minds had been stained as much as their stomachs emptied. Trauma was ritualized into penance, but never erased. And yet this silence shaped entire cultures. Folk tales born in these winters are not whimsical, but terrifying. Ghosts wandering snowy lanes, spirits luring travelers into drifts, witches stealing warmth from hearths. These stories were not inventions, they were memories reframed into cautionary tales, tools for teaching children that winter was an enemy that demanded respect and fear. Songs sung at hearths in December echoed with warnings, while prayers focused obsessively on deliverance from famine and frost. Even the architecture of medieval faith bears these scars. Churches filled with frescoes of skeletal death, hourglasses, and frozen landscapes, reminders that winter ruled as surely as Christ. And individuals bore scars that became communal memory. Survivors of famine winters often recounted them decades later, describing in obsessive detail the taste of bark bread, the smell of smoke-filled huts, the sound of wolves outside at night. These memories were passed down, embedding trauma into cultural identity. Winter did not just kill, it reshaped imaginations, taught people to see the world as hostile, survival as temporary, and death as inevitable. And perhaps most disturbingly, this mindset became self-perpetuating, and why the Fellapöver praying, that disturbingly, this mindset became self-perpetuating, and why the Fellapöver, the Earl to mind for it animal. People entered each new winter already broken by the last, expecting death, preparing for loss, teaching their children not hope but resignation. The silence after the screams was not peace, it was preparation, the pause before the cycle began again. In this way, medieval winter did not simply scar a season, it scarred centuries, leaving behind a psychology of dread that haunted Europe long after the snow melted. Chapter 13: Winter as Apocalypse, Famine, Faith, and the End of the World. For medieval people, winter was not merely a season, it was a rehearsal for the apocalypse. The book of Revelation, with its visions of famine, pestilence, and fire, was not distant scripture, but lived reality in every snow-choked lane. Chroniclers from the 14th century describe famine winters in terms borrowed directly from prophecy. The sun darkened, the moon bloodied, the earth barren. In 1317, when rains drowned fields across Europe, villagers starved in numbers so vast that clerics compared it to Noah's flood, believing the end times had come. Winter amplified these fears because it seemed to confirm divine wrath. Months of darkness felt like the sun itself retreating, an omen of cosmic punishment. Priests thundered from pulpits that God had turned his face from humanity, that the snow was his scourge, that hunger was proof of sin spreading like rot through society. And the people believed because how else could they interpret the sight of entire families, dead by February, the sound of wolves dragging corpses into forests, the endless tolling of church bells for burials. But apocalypse wasn't just preached, it was enacted. Famine processions wound through villages, barefoot peasants carrying relics, whipping themselves bloody in the snow to atone for sins that they thought had summoned God's anger. These were not rare. Penitential flagellation spread across Europe during famine winters, with hundreds walking together, chanting hymns until their voices froze in the air. The line between liturgy and hysteria blurred. Villagers saw comets in winter skies, auroras in polar regions, strange halos around the moon, and all were interpreted as signs of doom. Each bitter winter seemed to push humanity closer to the edge of judgment, and every catastrophe layered upon the last. After the Great Famine came the Black Death. After freezing winters came rumors of witchcraft and heresy. To the medieval mind, the pattern was clear. The end was not an abstraction, it was a season, and winter was its herald. And yet, these apocalyptic winters didn't just terrify, they structured society. They gave meaning to suffering, making starvation not just random cruelty, but part of God's plan. They reinforced hierarchy, priests as interpreters of wrath, lords as providers of scarce bread, kings as chosen shepherds to guide the flock through tribulation. In this way, apocalypse became politics, and winter became its theater. People accepted authority because rebellion seemed suicidal against not only armies, but against the very climate, which was read as divine decree. The disturbing truth is that apocalypse, for medieval people, was not an imagined catastrophe, but a lived one, recurring each year with the snow. And though spring always came, the memory of famine, winters when the world seemed to collapse into silence, hunger, and death, haunted imaginations as proof that the end of all things was never far away. Winter, in short, was not just cold, it was eschatology, a rehearsal for the day when sun and stars would truly vanish and Europe would freeze forever in the dark. Chapter 14, The Civilization of Cold, How Winters Forged the Medieval World. If winter was apocalypse rehearsed, it was also civilization defined. The disturbing reality is that the Middle Ages were not built in spite of winter, but because of it. Every institution, every ritual, every fragment of culture bore its imprint. The church calendar itself bent around the cold. Advent fasts, Christmas feasts, Epiphany processions, these were not merely celebrations of faith, but survival strategies designed to give structure to months of hunger and dark. Feasting early in winter was a psychological bulwark, a way of storing memory of abundance before scarcity hit, while Lent in February and March doubled as enforced rationing, cloaked in theology. Monasteries became repositories of survival knowledge, their cloisters housing grain stores, herb gardens, and chronicles that taught future generations when to sow and how to endure. Nobility reinforced their power through winter pageantry, hunts in snowy forests, tournaments staged in frozen courtyards, banquets where guests ate roasted boar and drank spiced wine, while peasants gnawed crusts in the dark. These spectacles were not just entertainment, they were propaganda, reminders that some were destined for warmth and others for frost. Winter also reshaped warfare and trade. Campaign seasons ended in October, not because armies feared the enemy, but because they feared the snow. Castles were designed with winter in mind, thick walls to retain heat, storerooms deep enough to survive sieges, chimneys that could vent smoke without collapsing under frost. Trade routes froze, forcing merchants to calculate risk, and entire economies were structured around the rhythm of scarcity and surplus. Even art and literature were molded by the season. Illuminated manuscripts depicted death as skeletal figures draped in frost, fields barren under white skies. Folk tales warned of snow spirits and famine demons, stories designed not just to frighten, but to discipline children into caution and thrift. Winter's brutality seeped into morality itself. Patience, endurance, and obedience were virtues, because without them, survival was impossible. And perhaps most profoundly, winter forged identity. To be European in the Middle Ages was to be a survivor of frost, to define yourself against the season that returned every year like an executioner demanding tribute. This shaped not only psychology, but theology, politics, and culture. The obsession with sin, death, and judgment, rooted in the cycles of famine, the glorification of suffering in Christian thought, shaped by centuries of endurance, the rigid hierarchies of lord and serf, reinforced by the desperate need for stability in the face of climate that could wipe out an entire village in one season. Winter was not a backdrop, it was the crucible, and the scars it left on civilization were permanent. Even today, Europe's traditions, Christmas feasts, New Year fires, Epiphany processions carry echoes of those centuries when survival through January and February was never guaranteed. The disturbing truth is this: the Middle Ages were not only built by kings, popes, and knights, but by winters that tested, broke, and remade every soul that endured them. Civilization itself was carved from ice. Chapter 15: Folklore of Frost. Myths, legends, and the shadows left behind. If famine carved scars on bodies and politics turned hunger into obedience, folklore was the means by which medieval people explained, endured, and remembered the terror of winter. The cold was not just weather, it was personified, mythologized, given names and faces, so that peasants could wrestle with its cruelty in the only language they had, story. In Germanic lands, the wild hunt thundered across frozen skies, a ghostly cavalcade led by Odin or a spectral king, sweeping away any who strayed too far at night. Villagers huddled indoors when winds howled, whispering that the hunt was riding, and to be caught outside was to be lost forever. In Slavic regions, frost itself became a figure: Morosko, Father Frost, sometimes a gift bringer, sometimes a killer, who froze children in the snow if offerings were not made. These stories were not fairy tales in the sense we imagine today. They were survival manuals wrapped in terror, teaching children to stay near the hearth, to conserve food, to respect the lethal power of the season. Every whispered legend was a reminder: winter was alive, and it was watching. And the darker tales revealed just how deeply trauma shaped imagination. Folklore is riddled with motifs of starvation: witches who lure children to eat them, demons who demand offerings of grain, spirits who punish gluttony by devouring the greedy. These were not inventions out of nowhere. They were echoes of lived famine, recast into allegory. When a mother told her children the story of Baba Yaga, the witch in the woods who cooked children in her oven, she was not only entertaining them, she was encoding the memory of winters when children really did disappear into the woods, either to gather firewood and never return, or carried away by wolves, or simply buried under snow until spring revealed their bodies. When tales spoke of giants who ate entire villages, or spirits that demanded tribute of bread or ale, they were mirrors of the harsh truth that winter itself consumed everything in its path. Even festivals, often seen as joyous, were born from dread. Yule logs, bonfires, feasts of midwinter, all were rituals of defiance against the dark, communal acts meant to reassure one another that the sun would return, that spring would come. Yet beneath the laughter lay fear, the recognition that fire and feasting were only temporary, and that the cold outside pressed in endlessly, indifferent to prayers or merriment. Songs sung in winter carried refrains of death and salvation, prayers for light buried under layers of melody. Medieval carols often mixed joy with desperation, the same way villagers mixed dwindling flour with acorn meal to stretch their bread. Even hope itself was rationed. And in this way, folklore, myth, and ritual were not escapes from winter, but extensions of it. Memory preserved in symbol, trauma transmuted into story. To walk through medieval Europe was to walk through a landscape haunted not only by bones in the snow, but by legends that gave those bones voices. And so, when we speak of the Middle Ages, we must remember that castles, cathedrals, and crusades were only half the story. The other half was winter, relentless, cyclical, indifferent. It shaped politics, birthed superstitions, scarred bodies, and rewired minds. It taught people to expect hunger, to live with death, to fear the dark. It filled Europe with bones and filled Europe's imagination with myths of frost and famine. Even today, echoes remain. Our winter holidays, our tales of witches and spirits, our fascination with survival against the elements. Beneath it all lies the memory of centuries when every December to March was a brush with apocalypse. The disturbing reality of a medieval winter is not just that it killed, but that it defined life. Survival was never victory, only postponement. And yet, from that endless cold, from that cycle of suffering, entire civilizations were forged. In the silence after the screams, in the thaw after the famine, people endured, told stories, built rituals, and carried forward. That endurance, haunted, scarred, but unbroken, is the true legacy of winter in the Middle Ages. And perhaps in some hidden corner of our own fears, when nights grow long and cold, presses in, we still remember it.